So I'm mixing up some reds here using my size 8 brush. I'm also using a little bit of Carmine, mixing that in with the red. So I've got a cooler red there. You can use Windsor red as well. This is a little bit of cobalt violet. So I've got lots of different sort of colours here, and I'm going to paint this tulip working sort of wet in wet. I'm using, it's actually cartridge paper, this sketchbook, so it only really allows me to do 2 layers. Because otherwise it buckles a little bit, etc. I'm adding a little bit of yellow now into the red, and so the consistency is quite milky. It's not too watery, so I'm going on with this yellow with a touch of red mixture here with my size 8 brush, working wet on dry. I've already sketched out an outline for this tulip here, so I'm keeping everything really nice and simple. The other thing you'll notice is water is my friend, so I've actually wet the top part of this tulip here, trying not to touch the background, and loading my brush again and getting lots and lots of water. And I'm actually even painting or wetting the stem as well, going in with a little bit of this pinky shade here that I mixed up. You can use permanent rose, and I'm painting this wet into wet in patches with my size 8 brush. So it's quite nice. I'm sort of almost tickling the paint on there as well, painting these sort of cooler pinker colours. They're quite pale here and there. I'm adding a little bit of yellow with a touch of red, wet in wet. You can see how wet it is because they're like little puddles. What I quite like with this is because you get some happy accidents as well, so maybe cauliflowers and backgrounds. I've dropped a little bit of red in there as well, all quite watery. And as you can see from the reference photograph there, it's just a simple red tulip, which I thought would be quite nice to do, especially if you're starting out as a beginner, but you want to loosen up so you don't have to worry about too many things. So I'm adding a little bit of red here. As you can see, I'm always going back to the triple water pot that I've got there to add water to dilute the paint, adding a little bit more pink here, and just sort of really kind of painting abstract sort of colours on this tulip here, not trying to copy the photograph, having fun with watercolour. This is what I love about watercolour painting, just sort of painting sort of colours, letting them bleed wet in wet on the watercolour paper, or in this instance here the sketchbook paper, which is the cartridge paper, and just seeing what happens. And it's quite therapeutic, and you learn a lot about what watercolour does. I've actually sort of painted in there, still using this size 8 brush, slightly creamier, thicker red there. You can use cadmium red, any red will do really, just have fun with it. And you can obviously mix in yellow with the red to warm it up, or even a alizarin crimson, or a permanent rose rather, or a carmine to cool it down. Even a little bit of violet to darken it up. So it's quite nice to experiment. So still using this size 8 brush. This is actually quite a thicker red here, and it's dried off a little bit at the top here. And I find with this particular sketchbook, which is a Concertina sketchbook, so part of the sketchbook challenge is I'm actually going to paint all these different flowers in here. And just to say thank you to all of those who have been sharing your suggestions, and please share those in the comments section below, and I will try to include them as best I can. Now, I don't often use a paper towel to wipe the excess paint on, but you may find that useful. If you notice, I use the water pot, and I actually sort of wipe off my brush that might be wet with water or paint on the side. I'll also do that with the palette, and that controls the amount of water or paint that's on my brush. And it's a kind of a habit that I have, but you may find a paper towel is more useful, especially if you're starting out. So I applied a slightly creamier, thicker paint there, and then I dropped in some water just to see what happens. Now, if you find the thinner the paper that you're using, the paper can buckle slightly or warp. This does happen. I'm not too worried in this instance for the sketchbook, because it's all just about playing and seeing what happens. But I've sort of just, again, experimenting here, dropping in paint and letting the colours mix wet on the paper. I've used a bit of lemon yellow here with a very light green, and I'm painting this sort of very limey green colour. First of all, starting off, I think that stem had dried off, so it was wet on dry, and just dropping in that limey colour with the lemon yellow, wet into wet here. I'm also painting the leaves here wet on dry to begin with, still with that size 8 brush, really sort of layering that paint on. Really load your brush, and I just applied a little bit more of the sort of mid-tone green. I think actually that's a little bit of cobalt teal actually I'm using on my palette there, but you can use cerulean as a good substitute, or even turquoise. So I'm just painting these very light limey green leaves of the tulip wet on dry, and then just dropping in colours or water wet into wet there, just carefully painting around the stem there as well. What I'm doing now for this abstract background is I'm just going to draw some shapes with my HB pencil. So I've included that in here just to divide the background up, sort of keeping the imaginary sort of leaves behind as well. So some of them might be sweeping sort of leaf shapes, but I'm not trying to exactly paint leaves. I just want this lovely abstraction here, different shapes, triangles even. So I'm just taking my time sort of drawing these lines here. And what's really nice about this, and easy actually, especially if you're a beginner, is you can just paint these shapes, make them colourful, drop in paints. It doesn't even have to look like anything, but you can work wet on dry, and you can just take your time just painting each individual shape like a painting on its own. And I sometimes leave little gaps between them, little white gaps of the paper, so it doesn't bleed in. But even if it bleeds to the next shape, don't worry. So as you can see here, I'm continuing on actually using this sort of lemon yellow colour with that sort of teal colour. Again, you can use cerulean. And I'm just sort of painting these shapes in the background, keeping it really simple, sometimes paling the colour using water and adding water. And I'm adding a little bit of ultramarine here, and just sort of carefully painting around these leaves. If you're worried about it bleeding onto the leaf, make sure those leaves have dried beforehand, and then you can paint this background here. You don't have to worry about backgrounds. It will just create lovely, interesting textures. But there's something very relaxing about using watercolours and painting abstract shapes in the background. It's very freeing up, and you've got this sort of positive tulip shape in the foreground, and as you can see here, I'm just dropping in these different colours, experimenting as well. So this is a little bit of Viridian. I've also used a little bit of forest green here, some of the colours that came with this set, and also I'm using water as well. Try not to touch the leaves. I'm going to work my way round now with using sort of different blues and different yellows to make greens, and even greens to make greens, and just enjoying it. It is sort of an abstraction of those leaves in the background, so you can use sort of cool colours as well, which is what I'm doing here, and just painting smaller shapes as well, maybe some a little bit darker to bring out the lighter shapes as well. But don't worry about that, just have fun with it. Another thing you can do with this abstract background is you can sprinkle a little bit of table salt or sea salt on there to create some textures, maybe a little bit of Brushe, a little bit of spattering. I've kept it really simple in this instance, but you can play around with it and just experiment with different mediums as well. It doesn't just have to be leaves in the background, it can be other tulips, not just red tulips, it can be some pink tulips as well. So I just add a little bit of the cobalt violet light there and pushed a little bit of green up there, wet into it. I'm painting another one here with the cobalt violet, still using my size 8 brush, painting wet on dry these abstract shapes in the background. I'm just painting the stem here now, wet on dry, starting off with a little bit of the limey green, adding a bit of darker green and then paling it as it goes towards the bottom of the stem and blending a little bit of shadow on the right hand side. I'm using a little bit of Phthalocyanine blue, you can use Prussian blue. I've added a little bit of the yellow and I'm working wet on dry. It's almost like a negative shape here, so it's the shape around the positive shapes, which are the leaves and the stem of this tulip, and because it's dark and the leaves of the tulip are lighter, it really brings those leaves forward and hopefully creates depth in the painting as well. I'm actually painting a soft shadow colour there on this left hand leaf here, wet on dry with my size 8 brush, and I'm actually painting a little bit of damp into damp, some of the colours on the leaf at the top there and on the bottom right hand side with a little bit of teal and lemon yellow. I'm going to allow my painting now to thoroughly dry off, and I'm going to work again back in the tulip using some of those reds, carmine, a little bit of alizarin crimson to paint darker washes there. So I'm starting out wet on dry, rinsing my brush, and I'm going to sort of dilute that little bit of red there to create some lighter tonal values. So you've got the sort of darker red, and I'm using the water to add a little bit of lighter tones. And I'm working as well wet on dry with my size 8 brush and painting a sort of darker red mark down the sort of left hand side here to show the separation of the petals there. So as the one petal is next to another, it creates a little bit of shadow, and by painting that I'm actually even using a little bit of violet now in the red there, dropping that in wet into wet, and then dropping a little bit of water in there wet into wet, and just really separating those petals now, adding a little bit of that colour here, painting that damp into damp now. This paper dries very quickly, so I'm sort of trying to be as quick as I can here, painting that damp into damp. But I'm going to carry on now painting these sort of reds, dividing up the petals, painting this lovely sort of richer red colour wet on dry, and then dropping colours wet into wet, and sort of using water as well to lighten the areas, to soften the hard edges, so I can keep some of my underpainting as well. While the paint is damp, I'm using a cocktail stick here. You could use a store card cut up just to scratch into the surface of the paper to create some darker marks and veins in the petals there. This is permanent, but it does create some lovely detailed effects, and what happens is the wet paint runs into the scratch to create a darker mark. So I'm working again, still wet on dry. I've added a little bit of alizarin crimson to the red here. I'm even using a little bit of the Phthalocyanine blue with a touch of the Cobalt violet here, light, and a bit of red, just sort of painting in all these different sort of colours that you can see on the tulip, and maybe some colours from straight from my imagination as well. But as you can see here, I'm sort of pushing wet paint into drying paint as well, and what happens when you do that is you get these cauliflowers and backruns, which I quite like, and you can see one developing right in the middle of, actually two developing right in the middle of that petal there, which is quite exciting. So I'm going to carry on sort of dropping in reds and pinks, alizarin crimsons, and just work my way round here, having fun. As you can see here, just where it's darker in the centre there, I'm adding really thicker alizarin crimson there, still using the size 8 brush, working damp into wet to create these darks here. If it doesn't look dark enough to you, can also add a little bit of violet as well. And I'm working this dark down the right hand side here, and then using a damp clean brush to blend so you get that lighter side of the edge there. But just carefully pulling this forward, this tulip forward from the background with these gorgeous reds, you know, sort of working in this very loose style, using the cocktail stick again to scratch into the surface of the petals there, of the paper, so the paint runs in there. And it's a lovely way of working with fine details without having to worry about using this with a small brush, and plus you'd have to wait for it to dry as well to paint these marks, so it's kind of a nice way of working. I'm painting a little bit of darker green here on the right hand side here, using the Phthalocyanine blue with some yellow, and adding a little bit more dark red here, damp into damp, still using my size size 8 brush with a bit of red and violet there, trying to be really brave, especially in the center here. If you don't want to back run, just make sure that your paint consistency on the brush is the same as what it is on the paper. And if your paper's really drying and the shine is going, wait for your painting to dry completely. You can then work wet on dry and then use a clean damp brush to soften the edge. So this, you can see, is very strong, a strong dark red here. So I've used a bit of alizarin, touch of violet and red in there, and again I'm softening with a clean, well, it's not a damp brush, it's actually quite a wet brush, but I quite like the effects that it creates there. So I'm just sort of finishing off some of the darks here underneath the bottom part of the tulip there, where there's less light. The light's at the top there, but obviously it's a little bit darker in the center there where there's less light. And again, just dropping in colors. I get asked a lot of questions about when do you know your painting is finished, and my advice is to actually maybe stop before you think you've finished, because sometimes you're in danger of overworking. So I've decided to leave the tulip alone and just glaze a little bit of pink or the cobalt violet in the background, wet on dry, and then soften with the damp brush. And it kind of pushes the background back a little bit, brings that tulip forward and creates a nice bit of depth and also colour harmony in your painting. So I've actually used quite a thick creamy cobalt violet light there, but added lots and lots of water, and as you can see they're glazing that colour over those bright green leaves there. So I'm just adding a little bit more of the cobalt violet, rinsing my brush, glazing that sort of wet brush there, doing the same with the yellow up there just to push it back a little bit with that pink there, or that cobalt violet light, and then just glazing. If you don't have cobalt violet light, you could actually just use violet really watered down, or even ultramarine with permanent rose watered down as well. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that it inspires you to paint flowers in watercolour, and also have given you some ideas of painting backgrounds in an abstract way in watercolour as well. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. Any suggestions for future flower tutorials, please put those in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, why not subscribe to my YouTube channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And those of you that want to learn more about watercolour and support my YouTube channel, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.